let's talk about double bubble maps and how to leverage and get the most out of them. So let's first talk about when you use double bubble maps or Venn diagrams in your classroom, who is doing the majority of the work? Often that I see, the majority of the work is done by the teacher or it's done by the class as a whole, but that individual students often check out or put very little effort into making and really thinking about the comparing and contrasting that is necessary for it to make a double bubble map. The other thing I want to think about is how do you ensure individual accountability if you do use teaming for double bubble maps? How do you ensure individual accountability so that you're sure that every student is thinking and learning? So let's look at two examples of double bubble maps. These are just real easy or small examples of students comparing and contrasting. And in these examples, you can see that there's individual accountability because students are using different colored pens to fill it out. And the other thing I want to point out is you'll notice here that there are words on the arrows. And I think that that's kind of key because it helps define the relationships between the two circles. Often students will put something in a circle and we as the teachers assume that we understand why they put that in the circle, but we want them to tell us, we want them to do the thinking, and asking a student to define the relationship between the two circles that they're drawing really helps ensure that they're thinking about the relationship between the two. One of the things I also want to point out is the power of starting with a real blank template, right? There's the two things you're comparing and contrasting in the middle, and other than that, this template is blank. And the power of that is that it really does make it where the students are comparing and contrasting. Otherwise, if you tell them that there's 3 circles in the middle and 3 circles on each end, they really are just filling in the blank. They're just looking for how many, let me find 3 comparisons, 3 differences, and let's call it done. And remembering that the purpose of a double bubble map is for students to compare and contrast 2 topics, we want to make sure that they're the ones comparing and contrasting. So let's talk about the fact that if you're used to doing double bubble maps with the circles in them, students might need more team directions because there's no directions needed if they know to put something in the circle. Whereas if we give them more of a blank slate, it is going to cause them to think in different ways, but we want to help them with that. So the first thing we want to do is set up team accountability. So we want to make sure every student uses a different color pencil or pen and that they write the 2 main topics in the center. And then of course we want them to count off 1 through 4 so that when we get to the directions, they know what order they're going to go in. So here's an example of some student directions. There's nothing profound about these directions, but they ensure that every student is expected to have a voice in the conversation to ensure accountability. I want to also point out that it's nice if we give the students some tips for writing concepts, because a lot of times our students who have struggled in the past or stayed silent if we did a group or a class double bubble map, they stayed silent because they didn't know what to put in the circles, and then they just copied what somebody else put in a circle. So really giving them some tips for writing the concepts and some tips for explaining the relationship between the 2 concepts. That way we're setting our students up for success. So notice that what we did was we didn't lower the cognitive load by telling them how many circles. We gave them support to advance and have a higher cognitive load within this task. So let's think about what support you might need. One of the things I want to talk about is resisting the temptation. I know in the beginning you're going to want to tell the students how many circles to draw. Instead, have them think it out themselves. Ask them where in their resources they're going to find these answers, right? The other thing I would say is resist the temptation to overcomplicate the map by adding squares or other shapes. Our students who traditionally have not done well with this are going to get overwhelmed. And what we really want to remember is that the purpose of a double bubble map is to compare and contrast. So we want to keep them focused on that. The other thing I want to point out is that we can do a couple of optional extensions. You can do different than the two I'm going to name, but one of the first things that comes to mind is peer feedback, right? Two teams can share each other's maps, give each other feedback, and then go back and revise their own. And then the other option is students can use the team double bubble map in order to create their own paragraph, essay, or presentation. So the planning for this ends up being pretty small, right? You need to identify the learning intentions, identify the members of each team, identify which resources or notes students are going to use to create their map, and then, of course, plan mini deadlines for students to check in and monitor progress. Some tips to think about also are making sure you set a timer. I'm going backwards here. Make sure you set a timer. Ensure that you have all the resources students need. Be specific about where they can find the information and show them examples so that they know what it looks like. So remembering that the purpose of a double bubble map is to compare and contrast. How are you really ensuring that it's the students who are comparing and contrasting? They aren't simply copying yours or someone else's thinking.